Ethan Wallace sat alone in the grand living room of his sprawling mansion, the echoes of silence louder than any conversation he had heard in years. The room, though meticulously decorated with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and priceless artwork, felt cold and lifeless. It was a palace devoid of purpose, much like its owner. At 52 years old, Ethan had everything most people could only dream of: fortune, status, and power. But now, none of it mattered. The terminal cancer diagnosis he'd received 2 months ago hung over him like a storm cloud, smothering any sense of control he once commanded. Every day since had been a numbing routine of detachment, as if withdrawing from life early could make the end more bearable. Stacks of papers cluttered the oak desk by the window. These weren't business contracts or investment proposals, but documents marking the dismantling of his empire. His prized collection of rare cars? Sold. The Manhattan penthouse? On the market. He had instructed his attorneys to liquidate his assets, donating the proceeds to causes he didn't care to research. He didn't need to know where the money went. He just needed it gone. Ethan leaned back into the plush leather armchair, staring at the unlit fireplace. The once burning ambition that had fueled his ruthless climb to the top was extinguished, replaced by a hollow ache. He had no heirs, no family, and no close friends to leave his wealth to. The people who had once surrounded him had been pushed away by his sharp tongue and colder actions. The sharp trill of his cell phone broke the silence, jarring him from his thoughts. He stared at the screen, noting the familiar name of his oncologist. He debated ignoring it. What more could they possibly tell him? But something about the persistence of the ringing drew his hand toward the phone. "Wallace," he answered curtly. "Mr. Wallace, this is Dr. Carter's office. He'd like you to come in for a consultation tomorrow." The voice on the other end said, calm but insistent, "You'll be meeting with Dr. Grace Sullivan. She specializes in cases like yours." Ethan grunted noncommittally, already planning to decline. But as he ended the call, a strange flicker of curiosity surfaced, a faint ember of something he couldn't yet name. For now, he dismissed it, retreating back into his solitude. But tomorrow loomed, bringing with it an unexpected possibility. Dr. Grace Sullivan moved through the bustling hospital corridors with practiced efficiency, her presence a rare combination of calm and warmth. At 33, she was one of Boston General's most dedicated physicians. Her colleagues admired her tireless work ethic, though few knew the personal struggles that accompanied her compassionate demeanor. Beneath the professional exterior, Grace carried the weight of responsibility far beyond the hospital walls. Her younger brother Tyler, just 17, had been shuffled between foster homes since their parents' tragic deaths years ago. Grace's attempts to secure custody had been met with endless legal and financial roadblocks. The thought of him living in instability haunted her every decision, fueling both her drive and her exhaustion. Despite it all, Grace maintained an unwavering empathy for her patients. She believed that even the smallest kindness could ripple outward, a philosophy shaped by her own experiences of being lifted up during her darkest times. That morning, Grace reviewed Ethan Wallace's file. The name was familiar. His reputation for ruthless business dealings had made headlines for years. But to her, he was just another patient, someone in need of care. She stepped into the consultation room with her usual composure, her brown eyes warm but professional. "Mr. Wallace," she greeted, her voice steady but gentle. "I'm Dr. Sullivan. I'll be overseeing your treatment moving forward." Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable. He had the air of someone who'd seen the worst in people and expected no different from her. "Let's make this quick," he muttered, not bothering to meet her gaze for long. Grace ignored the curt tone, focusing instead on the man behind the gruffness. His posture was tense, his eyes tired but guarded. He wasn't the first patient to resist vulnerability, and he wouldn't be the last. The consultation proceeded efficiently, though Grace's empathetic manner seemed to catch Ethan off guard. Her questions were thorough yet considerate, her responses direct yet laced with understanding. As they wrapped up, Ethan lingered by the door, his curiosity unexpectedly piqued. Before leaving, he heard Grace in the adjacent room, kneeling beside a young patient. Her words were soft, reassuring, as she calmed the child with a quiet confidence that spoke of genuine care. Ethan paused, her kindness striking a chord. He left the hospital with an unusual thought. Perhaps there was more to her than just another doctor doing her job. For the first time in weeks, something stirred, a faint spark in the cold. Grace Sullivan often found herself revisiting the past in quiet moments between hospital rounds. The memories came unbidden, fragments of a childhood defined by loss and resilience. She had been just 16 when a car accident took her parents, leaving her and her younger brother Tyler adrift in the foster system. The first few months had been the hardest. Grace, fiercely protective of Tyler, had tried to shield him from the worst of their situation, but the system wasn't designed for keeping siblings together. They were separated, Tyler placed with strangers while Grace bounced between homes, her determination to reunite with him growing with every passing year. Despite the odds, Grace's focus never wavered. She buried herself in academics, using education as her escape and her weapon. Eventually, scholarships paved the way to medical school, but the guilt of leaving Tyler behind had always lingered. By the time she was in a position to fight for him, Tyler was a teenager with a string of unstable placements, his trust in the system and in people shattered. In the present, Grace worked tirelessly to bring some semblance of stability to her life and Tyler's. Her days were a blur of patient charts, rounds, and late-night consultations. The hospital was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where her efforts felt immediate and impactful, even if her personal life felt like a losing battle. Tyler, now 17, was still in foster care, living with a family Grace barely knew. Their relationship was strained. He was quick to lash out, accusing her of abandoning him when he needed her most. Grace's heart broke every time she replayed those conversations, knowing her intentions hadn't been enough to shield him from the pain of their circumstances. That evening, as Grace sorted through a stack of mail at her kitchen table, her stomach tightened when she saw the envelope from the state agency. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the letter. Tyler's foster placement was under review, and the possibility of him being moved yet again loomed large. Her grip on the paper tightened. Another upheaval could undo what little progress he had made. She couldn't let it happen. Grace stared out the window into the dark Boston night, her mind racing with the weight of her responsibilities. Somewhere, amidst the chaos of her thoughts, a spark of determination reignited. She would find a way to keep Tyler safe, no matter what it took. The letter sat on the table as a silent challenge. Grace was no stranger to uphill battles, and this one would be no different. Ethan Wallace sat in the corner of the hospital lounge, waiting for the next round of tests, his gaze wandering idly through the bustling corridors. It was a world far removed from his own, a place where people moved with purpose, driven not by profit margins, but by something he had long forgotten: compassion. His thoughts drifted back to a time when his own life was filled with purpose, though it had been of a different kind. Born into a modest family in rural Maine, Ethan's rise to wealth had been as meteoric as it was unforgiving. The son of a steelworker, he had learned early that success wasn't handed to anyone. It was seized. In his 20s, Ethan had clawed his way up the corporate ladder, leveraging every opportunity and crushing every obstacle in his path. By 40, he was a self-made millionaire, owning a portfolio of companies that spanned real estate, tech, and manufacturing. But his ambition came at a cost. Along the way, relationships were collateral damage. His brother, Daniel, had been the first casualty, their bond severed over a bitter business deal. Ethan hadn't spoken to Daniel in over 15 years. Other friendships had eroded under the weight of his relentless drive, and romantic relationships were fleeting, doomed by his refusal to prioritize anything but his empire. What remained now, as he faced the end of his life, was the hollow echo of a success story told too many times. A soft laugh pulled Ethan from his reverie. He glanced toward the nurse's station, where Dr. Grace Sullivan stood speaking with a patient's family. Her face was animated, her hands gesturing gently as she explained something with clarity and patience. The family nodded, their expressions shifting from fear to relief as her words sank in. Ethan found himself watching her more often during his visits. She moved through the hospital with quiet confidence, treating everyone, patients, staff, even him, with the same level of respect and care. It was disarming. The next time she entered his room, Ethan couldn't hold back his curiosity. "Why do you care so much?" he asked abruptly, catching Grace off guard. She paused, her expression softening as she studied him. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible," she said simply. "And no one should feel that way." Her words lingered long after she left, stirring something in Ethan he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't put a name to it yet, but it was enough to make him wonder if he had misjudged the world and himself. Ethan watched as Grace sat across from him, the morning light filtering into the hospital room. She had just finished reviewing his test results, but her calm demeanor suggested no urgency. She lingered, as if sensing his hesitation to let her leave. He cleared his throat. "What you said the other day, about not wanting people to feel invisible. That's not exactly a common perspective these days." Grace tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "It's not about being common or uncommon. It's about being human. Everyone has their struggles, even the people who seem like they don't." Ethan's brow furrowed. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure why her words unsettled him. "You make it sound like helping people is some kind of higher calling." "Maybe it is," Grace replied with a small smile. "Or maybe it's just a way to remind myself that the world isn't as cold as it sometimes feels." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossing defensively. "That kind of thinking doesn't get you very far." "It depends on how you measure far," she said, her tone unyielding but not unkind. Her words struck deeper than he wanted to admit. He had spent his life defining success by power, wealth, and status. Grace's definition, though, seemed foreign and irritatingly compelling. After a moment of silence, Grace looked down at her hands, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the clipboard she held. "There was a patient I had during my residency," she began softly. "A little girl, just 6 years old, with a congenital heart defect. Her parents had almost given up. They thought there was no hope left. But she fought through every setback, every procedure. And the day she walked out of the hospital, she hugged me so tightly, like I had saved her whole world." Her voice grew quieter, more introspective. "I think about her sometimes when I'm tired, when it feels like the work is too much. She reminds me why I do this, because even the smallest victories can mean everything to someone else." Ethan said nothing, his gaze fixed on her. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of shame, not for his wealth or his choices, but for how small his world had become. Grace had seen life at its most fragile, yet she still chose to believe in its worth. As she stood to leave, Ethan's voice stopped her. "What happened to the girl?" "She's 12 now," Grace replied with a smile. "Still fighting." The image lingered in Ethan's mind long after she left, a quiet but powerful reminder of the resilience he had lost, and perhaps could still find. Ethan sat in the hospital's waiting area, watching the ebb and flow of the staff. It was late, far later than he thought anyone should still be working. Yet there was Dr. Grace Sullivan, moving with her usual energy despite the visible exhaustion in her posture. She leaned against the counter at the nurse's station, flipping through charts with one hand, while taking sips from a cold cup of coffee in the other. Ethan noticed the faint circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged just slightly when she thought no one was looking. His thoughts were interrupted by a rattling cough that escaped his chest. He reached for a handkerchief, annoyed at how persistent the symptom had become. Yet, even as he struggled with his own discomfort, his attention returned to Grace. She deserved better than this grind, he thought. The next morning, while waiting for another round of tests, Ethan made a call. Through one of his financial advisors, he arranged for an anonymous deposit to be made into an account linked to the hospital's employee support fund. He ensured the money would specifically cover additional staffing to alleviate Grace's workload. The gesture was quiet, almost mechanical, yet it brought an odd sense of satisfaction. Ethan wasn't used to giving without expecting something in return, and the unfamiliarity of it unsettled him. A week later, Grace walked into his room with a curious expression. She set down her clipboard and crossed her arms. "Something strange happened," she began. "The hospital suddenly approved additional funding for more staff in my department. No one seems to know where it came from." Ethan raised an eyebrow, feigning disinterest. "Why tell me? I'm just a patient." Grace studied him, her sharp gaze searching for something in his carefully blank expression. "Because I think you had something to do with it," she said, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "And if I did?" Her expression softened, though her tone remained firm. "Then I'd want to know why." For a moment, he considered deflecting, but the look in her eyes held him in place. "Maybe I just wanted to make your life a little easier," he admitted finally, his voice quieter than usual. Grace hesitated, caught between gratitude and unease. "I'm not sure if I should thank you or be offended that you think I need saving," she said with a wry smile. Ethan chuckled, the sound lighter than he'd expected. "Do both, if it makes you feel better." As she left, Grace found herself smiling despite her initial frustration. She didn't fully understand Ethan's motivations yet, but she couldn't ignore the faint glimmer of something human beneath his guarded exterior. Grace lingered at the doorway to Ethan's room, her hands gripping the edge of his chart. He was seated by the window, his gaze distant, lost in the winter landscape beyond the glass. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure how to approach the conversation. Finally, she stepped inside, her shoes tapping softly on the floor. "You know," she began, her tone light but pointed, "most patients don't meddle in their doctor's workload." Ethan turned his head, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "Most doctors don't work themselves into the ground." Grace crossed her arms, tilting her head as she studied him. "You don't strike me as the charitable type, Ethan." "Why help me?" he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe I saw someone fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight alone." The simplicity of his answer caught her off guard. Grace was accustomed to deflective humor or hardened detachment from patients like Ethan, those who had spent their lives guarding their vulnerabilities. But there was something in his voice, a flicker of sincerity, that made her pause. "That's not an answer," she countered gently, stepping closer. "You could have done nothing, and I wouldn't have blamed you. So why bother?" Ethan's eyes narrowed, as if he were weighing his next words carefully. "Maybe because it's easier to fix something for someone else than to face what's broken in yourself." His admission hung in the air between them, the weight of it sinking in. Grace lowered herself into the chair across from him, her expression softening. "Is that what this is about?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Fixing something in yourself?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze shifting back to the window. When you hear the clock ticking louder every day, you start thinking about what's left. And for me, there's not much. Grace leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "That's not true," she said firmly. "You're here, Ethan. That means there's still time to decide what you leave behind." Her words struck a nerve, but instead of deflecting, Ethan let the silence stretch. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You really believe that, don't you?" he asked. "I do," Grace replied without hesitation. "And I think you do too, even if you don't want to admit it." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "You're relentless. You know that?" "It's part of the job," she said with a small smile. After a moment, Ethan straightened in his chair. "You should come by the house sometime," he said casually, though his tone carried an undercurrent of something more deliberate. "I'd like to go over my treatment plan in a quieter setting." Grace raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the sudden invitation. "You mean you want to play host in that fortress you call a home?" Ethan smirked. "Something like that. Think of it as a change of scenery." She hesitated, sensing there was more behind his offer than simple convenience. But she nodded, deciding to accept the opportunity to learn more about the man behind the walls he'd built. "All right," she said, standing. "But only if you promise to keep things professional." Ethan's smirk widened just slightly. "I'll do my best." As Grace left the room, she couldn't help but feel that a small barrier had been lowered between them. And for the first time, Ethan felt a quiet sense of anticipation, something he hadn't felt in years. Grace stepped out of her car, her gaze sweeping across the vast estate in front of her. Ethan Wallace's home wasn't just a house, it was a fortress. Towering gates and a long driveway led to a sprawling mansion surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens. It was the epitome of wealth and success, yet it felt devoid of warmth, almost museum-like. Ethan greeted her at the door, his expression neutral but his posture more relaxed than she'd seen before. "Welcome," he said, gesturing for her to enter. As she stepped inside, Grace's eyes were drawn to the marble floors, the vaulted ceilings, and the walls adorned with expensive art. Everything was pristine, but there was no sign of life. No family photos, no clutter, no evidence of joy. "You live here alone?" she asked, unable to hide the surprise in her voice. Ethan nodded. "Always have. A house this big has its advantages when you don't like people invading your space." Grace smiled faintly, though she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness at his words. "It must get lonely," she said softly. Ethan shrugged. "You get used to it." They moved to the sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. The room was impeccably arranged, but the silence felt heavy. Grace set her bag down, her gaze lingering on a dusty piano in the corner. "Do you play?" she asked, motioning to it. "I used to," Ethan admitted, his voice quieter. "Haven't touched it in years." Grace nodded, sensing a story there but choosing not to press. Instead, she took a seat on the couch and glanced at him. "You said you wanted to discuss your treatment plan." Ethan settled into the armchair opposite her, but instead of diving into medical questions, his expression grew contemplative. "I invited you here because I wanted to talk about something else," he said after a moment. "You seem like someone who understands what it's like to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "I guess I do." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What's your story, Grace? Why do you push yourself so hard for other people?" She took a deep breath, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "My brother, Tyler. He's 17 and still in foster care. I've been fighting to get custody of him, but it's complicated. Financially, legally, everything. I've spent my whole life trying to make things better for us, but it's like I'm always one step behind." Her voice wavered slightly as she continued. "He's a good kid, but he's angry. And who can blame him? He feels abandoned, and sometimes I wonder if I've done enough to fix that." Ethan's expression softened, a rare flicker of empathy crossing his face. "You've done more than most would, Grace. You're still fighting for him. That counts for something." Grace looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "You really think so?" "I know so," Ethan said firmly. "The world is full of people who turn their backs on what's hard. You didn't. That says a lot about you." For a moment, the room felt warmer, the emotional distance between them shrinking. But the heaviness in Ethan's chest lingered as he thought about Tyler. Angry, adrift, and searching for something he might never find. "I'd like to help," Ethan said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Grace's eyes widened. "Ethan, you've already done more than you needed to with the hospital funding." "This isn't about that," Ethan replied. "Just think about it." As Grace left the mansion later that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan understood her struggles in a way few others could. And for Ethan, her story stayed with him, an unrelenting reminder of his own past and the bonds he had severed long ago. Ethan arrived at the hospital for yet another round of tests, his mood as sour as the bitter coffee he had hastily grabbed on his way in. He wasn't sure if it was the monotony of his medical routine or the quiet unease stirred by Grace's visit to his home, but he felt uncharacteristically restless. As he walked through the lobby, he noticed a boy slouched in one of the chairs near the reception desk. The teenager had headphones on and was absently bouncing one leg, his expression a mix of boredom and irritation. Something about him seemed familiar, perhaps the defiance in his posture or the sharpness in his eyes. Ethan's curiosity deepened when Grace appeared, approaching the boy with an exasperated smile. "Tyler," she said, her voice gentle but firm. The boy pulled out one earbud, glancing at her. "What?" "I've been waiting forever." Grace sighed, lowering herself to his level. "I told you, I'd be a little late." "It's not that bad." Tyler muttered something under his breath, crossing his arms, but Ethan caught the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ethan lingered, pretending to read a notice on the wall while watching the interaction unfold. Grace didn't seem like the scolding type, but she had a quiet authority about her that made the boy listen. A nurse appeared, calling Ethan's name. He began to follow her but hesitated, glancing back. Before he could stop himself, he walked over to Grace and Tyler. "Friend of yours?" Ethan asked, gesturing to the boy. Grace turned, startled by his sudden appearance. "Ethan," she said, standing. "This is my brother, Tyler." "Tyler, this is Ethan Wallace, one of my patients." Tyler gave Ethan a once-over, his brow furrowing. "You don't look sick," he said bluntly. Ethan chuckled dryly. "You'd be surprised." Tyler shrugged, putting his headphones back in, but something in his gaze lingered, as if he were sizing Ethan up. Grace looked slightly embarrassed. "Sorry about him," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "Don't be. He's got a spark. Reminds me of someone I used to know." A short silence settled before Ethan crouched slightly to meet Tyler's eye level. "You like a challenge?" Tyler raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Depends." Ethan smirked. "Good. Never let that go. It'll take you places, kid." Tyler didn't respond, but his expression softened. For the first time, he seemed to see Ethan as more than just another adult. The moment passed quickly, but it lingered with Ethan throughout his appointment. By the time he left the hospital, he couldn't shake the thought of Tyler, sharp, stubborn, and clearly carrying a heavy weight. He reminded Ethan of himself at that age, and that realization brought a pang of both regret and admiration. That evening, Ethan made a phone call to his financial advisor. This time, he didn't just want to ease Grace's burden. He wanted to do something specifically for Tyler. "Set up an account," Ethan instructed. "Make it anonymous, but make sure the funds can be used for legal assistance, educational support, whatever the kid needs." His advisor hesitated. "Are you sure about this? It's a significant amount." "I'm sure," Ethan said firmly. As he hung up, Ethan felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease. He had spent years fortifying his defenses, keeping others at a distance. But now, Grace and Tyler had cracked something open, leaving him both vulnerable and unexpectedly hopeful. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself wanting to make a difference, not through grand gestures or public acts, but through quiet, meaningful change. And for once, he didn't need anyone to know it was him. The dining room in Ethan's home was as grand as the rest of the mansion. High ceilings, chandeliers casting a soft golden glow, and a long table that could seat a dozen guests. Tonight, though, it was just Ethan and Grace, seated at one end of the table that felt as vast as an ocean. Ethan had insisted on the dinner, calling it a gesture of thanks for her tireless dedication. Grace had reluctantly agreed, partly out of curiosity about the man she was slowly beginning to understand, and partly because she sensed he needed the company more than he let on. As they ate, the atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. The meal was simple, a sharp contrast to the extravagance of the setting. Grace's gaze drifted over the room, taking in the emptiness of the space. "You know," she said, her voice light but curious, "for a house this big, it doesn't feel very lived in." Ethan smirked, setting his glass of wine down. "That's because it isn't. This place has always been more of a statement than a home." "Statement about what?" He shrugged. "That I was successful. That I'd made it. At least, that's what I told myself at the time." Grace studied him for a moment. "And now?" Ethan hesitated, his fork pausing mid-air. "Now it just feels hollow." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She set her utensils down and leaned forward slightly. "What would make it feel whole?" Ethan chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "If I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here, staring down a terminal diagnosis." The vulnerability in his words hung in the air, and Grace found herself drawn to the man behind the layers of wealth and cynicism. "You still have time," she said gently, "to figure out what matters and to do something about it." Ethan looked at her, his guarded expression softening. "What about you? What keeps you going when everything feels like it's falling apart?" Grace hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "Tyler," she admitted quietly, "and the hope that someday we'll have the kind of stability we've always wanted." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "He's lucky to have you," he said after a pause. Grace smiled faintly. "I'm the lucky one. He's the only family I have left." There was a silence between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with something unspoken. Ethan swirled his wine glass absently, the conversation tugging at something deep within him. "I know it hasn't been easy for you," he said softly. Grace blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. "How do you know that?" Ethan froze, realizing too late the slip in his words. "I mean, you've mentioned Tyler, and I can see how much you care about him." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across her face. "I haven't told you much about my situation, Ethan. How do you know it's been hard?" He stumbled, his usual composure slipping. It wasn't hard to guess. You're a doctor, working long hours, taking care of a brother in foster care. It doesn't take a genius to connect the dots." Grace watched him carefully, her instincts telling her there was more to his words. But she let it go, sensing his discomfort. "Fair enough," she said, her tone even. The rest of the dinner passed with lighter conversation, but the moment lingered in Grace's mind as she drove home. Ethan's comment had struck her as odd, but what unsettled her more was the way he had looked at her, as though he carried a secret he wasn't ready to share. In the quiet of his mansion, Ethan sat alone, staring at the empty chair across from him. He knew he'd come dangerously close to revealing too much, and yet, a part of him wondered if Grace already sensed the truth he wasn't ready to admit. Ethan sat in his study, the only room in his vast mansion that felt remotely personal. The heavy oak desk was cluttered with papers, legal documents, medical files, and now, something new that felt heavier than all the rest combined. In his hand was an old photograph, yellowed at the edges. It was of his brother, Daniel, taken decades ago. Daniel's smile was familiar, sharp and confident, much like Ethan's had once been. But it wasn't just the photo that had thrown Ethan into turmoil. It was the accompanying record, unearthed through his financial inquiries into Grace and Tyler's situation. The records confirmed what Ethan had begun to suspect after his conversations with Grace. Tyler's last name, Sullivan, wasn't coincidental. Daniel Sullivan, Ethan's estranged brother, had fathered Grace and Tyler. They were his family. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his chest tightening. The revelation hit harder than he expected. He hadn't spoken to Daniel in over 15 years, not since their falling out over a business deal that had torn them apart. Ethan had buried that chapter of his life, assuming it was closed forever. But now, sitting with the evidence in his hands, he realized the past wasn't done with him. The weight of the decision loomed over him. Should he tell Grace and Tyler the truth? Part of him wanted to, desperately. It was a chance to make amends, to reconnect with a piece of the family he thought he'd lost. But another part of him hesitated. What if they saw it as manipulation? What if the truth destroyed the fragile trust he'd started to build with Grace? Ethan rubbed his temples, the ache of indecision gnawing at him. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain, but Grace and Tyler had shaken something loose in him, something raw and unfamiliar. The sound of the doorbell pulled him from his thoughts. A few moments later, Grace walked into his study, carrying a file. "I wanted to drop off the updated treatment plan," she said, her voice casual. But her expression shifted when she saw the papers spread across Ethan's desk. Her gaze landed on one document in particular, a legal notice regarding Tyler's custody case. Her brow furrowed as she stepped closer. "Ethan, what is this?" Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. "Grace, I can explain." Her eyes widened as she scanned the document. "You've been involved in Tyler's case? Why? How?" He stood, holding up a hand. "I was trying to help. That's all." Grace's voice sharpened. "Without telling me?" "Ethan, this isn't something you can just throw money at. This is my family, my responsibility." "I know that," Ethan said, his voice quieter but no less firm. "But I've seen how much you're carrying, Grace. I wanted to take some of the weight off your shoulders." Grace shook her head, a mixture of anger and confusion clouding her expression. "Do you even understand what this feels like? To fight so hard for someone you love, and then find out someone else is pulling strings behind your back?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I do understand," he said, his voice suddenly heavy with emotion. "More than you know." Grace blinked, startled by the intensity in his tone. "What are you talking about?" Ethan hesitated, the truth clawing at him from the inside. He opened his mouth to speak but faltered, fear rooting him in place. I've made mistakes, Grace, and I'm trying to make up for them the only way I know how." Her shoulders slumped slightly, the tension between them softening. "I know you mean well, Ethan, but this isn't just about you trying to fix things. It's about trust, and you should have told me." Ethan nodded, guilt etched into his face. "You're right. I should have." Grace sighed, her voice quieter now. "I need some time to process this. I appreciate what you've done, but this is a lot." As she turned to leave, Ethan's hand clenched at his side. The words he wanted to say burned in his throat, but he couldn't bring himself to stop her. When the door clicked shut, the silence in the study felt suffocating. Ethan stared at the photograph of Daniel on his desk, his brother's face a haunting reminder of what was at stake. The truth wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about Grace, Tyler, and a chance to mend what had been broken for so long. But whether he had the courage to tell them was a question that lingered, heavy and unresolved. Grace paced the length of Ethan's study, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. The tension in the room was palpable, each word spoken only escalating the emotions already teetering on the edge. "I trusted you, Ethan," she said, her voice low but trembling. "I let you into my life, into Tyler's life, and you went behind my back. How could you think that was okay?" Ethan stood near his desk, his hands gripping the edge as if it were the only thing grounding him. "I wasn't trying to undermine you, Grace," he said, his voice measured but strained. "I just wanted to help." "You don't get it," she snapped, turning to face him. Her eyes were bright with anger, but beneath it, there was pain. "This isn't about the money or the legal case. It's about you keeping me in the dark. How am I supposed to trust someone who hides things from me?" Ethan sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't think you'd understand." "Understand what?" Grace demanded. "That you thought throwing money at the problem would solve everything? That you didn't trust me to handle my own life?" "It wasn't about that." Ethan's voice rose for the first time, startling both of them. He took a step closer, his expression torn. "I've seen what you're dealing with, Grace. I've seen how much you've sacrificed, how much you've carried on your own. I thought if I could take even a little of that burden off you, it would help. But you didn't ask me," she said, her tone quieter now but no less cutting. "You didn't give me a choice." The silence between them was thick, each trying to find the words that would make the other understand. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice raw. "I've made mistakes, more than I can count. And every time I try to fix something, I just seem to make it worse. But with you and Tyler, I saw a chance to do something right. I didn't want to mess it up." Grace stared at him, her anger softening just slightly, but the betrayal still lingered, heavy and undeniable. "I appreciate what you've done for Tyler," she said after a long pause. "But this isn't about fixing things, Ethan. It's about being honest. And right now, I don't know if I can believe you." Before Ethan could respond, Grace's phone buzzed on the desk. She picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the message. Her face paled. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, his concern immediate. "It's Tyler," she said, her voice tight. "His foster parents just called. He didn't come home after school. They don't know where he is." Ethan's chest tightened. "Did they check with his friends? The school?" "They've tried," Grace replied, already grabbing her coat. "I need to go. He's been acting out lately, and I should have seen this coming." "I'll come with you," Ethan said, grabbing his own coat without hesitation. Grace hesitated, torn between wanting his support and feeling the sting of their earlier argument. But the urgency of the situation left no room for pride. "Fine," she said, heading toward the door. They drove in tense silence, Grace clutching her phone as she called every number she could think of. The streets blurred past, her thoughts racing with worry and guilt. "Do you have any idea where he might go?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "There's a park he used to go to when things got bad," Grace said, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. "It's a long shot, but it's worth checking." When they arrived at the park, it was nearly dark. The air was cold, and the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees added to the eerie stillness. Grace called out Tyler's name, her voice echoing in the empty space. They searched for what felt like hours, the weight of their earlier argument forgotten in the face of their shared fear. Finally, Ethan spotted a figure sitting on a swing at the far end of the park. "Grace," he said, pointing. She ran toward Tyler, relief washing over her as she saw him hunched over, his headphones around his neck. "Tyler!" He looked up, his expression guarded but startled. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. "You scared me half to death." Tyler shrugged, his tone defiant. "I just needed space. Everyone's always on my case." Ethan approached slowly, his presence calm but commanding. "Running off doesn't solve anything, kid," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It just makes the people who care about you worry." Tyler's gaze shifted between them, his defenses wavering. Grace knelt in front of him, her hands resting on his knees. "Tyler, we're in this together. But I can't help you if you shut me out." Tyler hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Ethan placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder, a gesture both grounding and reassuring. "Let's get you home." As they walked back to the car, Grace glanced at Ethan, gratitude flickering in her eyes. For all the tension between them, she couldn't deny that, in this moment, she was glad he was there. And for Ethan, the quiet bond they shared in their search for Tyler felt like a step towards something he couldn't quite name, but hoped he could hold on to. The night stretched on as Grace and Ethan continued their search for Tyler. The earlier relief of finding him at the park had been short-lived when Tyler, angry and feeling cornered, had run off again. Now, driving through the quiet streets, Grace's worry gnawed at her, the weight of guilt growing heavier with every passing minute. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his sharp eyes scanning the sidewalks and alleyways. The tension in the car was palpable, but it wasn't the suffocating kind they had felt earlier. This was born of shared concern, their differences momentarily forgotten in the urgency of finding Tyler. "He's angry," Grace said, her voice shaky. "He feels like I don't understand him, like I'm failing him." Ethan glanced at her, his voice calm but firm. "Grace, kids don't always know how to process what they're feeling, especially when they've been through as much as he has." She gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I just want him to know I'm here for him, no matter what." Ethan hesitated before responding. "He knows," he said quietly, "even if he won't say it right now." They turned onto another street, the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. Grace suddenly hit the brakes, her eyes locking on a figure in the distance. Tyler was there, standing near the edge of an abandoned construction site. Grace and Ethan got out of the car and hurried toward him. The wind had picked up, and Tyler's hoodie did little to shield him from the chill. He stood near a precarious drop-off, staring down into the shadows below. "Tyler," Grace called, her voice carrying a mix of relief and urgency. He turned to face her, his expression conflicted. "Why can't you just leave me alone?" he shouted. "Because I care about you," Grace said, stepping closer. "I know you're angry, and I know it's not fair what life's thrown at you. But running away won't fix it." Tyler shook his head, his voice breaking. "You don't get it. I feel like I don't belong anywhere. Like I'm just in the way." Grace's heart ached at his words. She took another cautious step forward, her hands outstretched. "You're not in the way, Tyler. You're my family. I've fought for you every day since I lost you the first time, and I'll keep fighting for you." As she spoke, Tyler's foot slipped on the loose gravel near the edge, and he stumbled backward. Ethan's reaction was immediate. He surged forward, catching Tyler's arm just before he could fall. The effort sent a shock of pain through Ethan's body, but he gritted his teeth and pulled the boy to safety. "Careful, kid," Ethan said, his voice strained but steady. "You're not going anywhere on my watch." Tyler's breath came in shallow gasps as he clung to Ethan's arm, the near fall shaking him to his core. For the first time, he looked at Ethan with something other than suspicion. "You didn't have to do that," Tyler mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Yes, I did," Ethan replied simply, his hand gripping Tyler's shoulder firmly. Grace rushed to their side, wrapping her arms around Tyler. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tyler nodded, his expression softening as he looked at her. I'm sorry, he whispered. Before Grace could respond, Ethan's knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground. Ethan, Grace cried, lowering him carefully. I'm fine, Ethan said weakly, though his pale face and labored breathing told a different story. No, you're not, Grace said, her voice firm as she checked his pulse. You've been pushing yourself too hard. Ethan tried to wave her off. It's nothing, just need a minute. But Grace wasn't convinced. You saved him, Ethan, she said softly. But now I need to make sure you're okay. With Tyler's help, she managed to get Ethan back to the car. The drive to the hospital was tense, Grace alternating between checking on Ethan and reassuring Tyler. When they arrived, Ethan was immediately taken to a treatment room. Grace stayed with Tyler in the waiting area, her hand resting on his shoulder as he leaned against her. I didn't mean for this to happen, Tyler said, his voice full of guilt. Grace kissed the top of his head. It's not your fault, she said gently. Ethan cares about you. He wanted to make sure you were safe. A few hours later, a nurse informed them that Ethan was stable and resting. Grace and Tyler stepped into his room, where he lay propped up in bed, looking tired but defiant. You didn't have to do all this, Ethan said, his voice raspy. Grace crossed her arms, a small smile tugging at her lips. I seem to recall you telling me the same thing not too long ago. Ethan chuckled, though it quickly turned into a cough. Fair enough. Tyler stepped forward hesitantly. Thanks, he said quietly, for saving me. Ethan met his gaze, his expression softening. Anytime, kid. The room fell into a comfortable silence, the shared ordeal forging a bond between them that hadn't been there before. And for Ethan, the thought that he might have finally done something meaningful brought a flicker of peace he hadn't felt in years. The fluorescent lights in the hospital waiting room hummed faintly as Grace paced back and forth, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Tyler sat nearby, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the floor. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity as they waited for news about Ethan. Is he going to be okay? Tyler finally asked, his voice small. Grace stopped pacing and knelt in front of him, placing a reassuring hand on his knee. The doctors are doing everything they can. He's strong, she said, though her voice wavered. We just have to trust them. Moments later, a nurse emerged, her face calm but serious. Dr. Sullivan? Grace straightened, her heart racing. Yes? Mr. Wallace is stable for now, the nurse said. He's been moved to a private room. You can see him, but only for a short while. Relief washed over Grace as she turned to Tyler. Stay here for a bit, okay? I'll let you know how he's doing. Tyler nodded silently, and Grace followed the nurse down the hallway. When she entered Ethan's room, the sight of him lying pale and frail in the hospital bed took her breath away. The man who had always carried himself with an air of strength and control now seemed vulnerable, the weight of his illness impossible to ignore. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, a faint smirk tugging at his lips when he saw her. You look worried, he murmured, his voice hoarse. Grace crossed her arms, her expression soft but firm. You scared me, Ethan, he sighed, shifting slightly against the pillows. Sorry about that. Not my best moment. Grace pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, her gaze steady on his. You pushed yourself too hard. You can't keep doing this, Ethan. You have to take care of yourself. Ethan chuckled weakly. Ironic, isn't it? Me giving advice to everyone else and ignoring my own limits. A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken words. Grace finally broke it, her voice quiet. Why do you care so much about Tyler and me? Ethan hesitated, his eyes searching hers. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as though weighing whether to finally tell her the truth. Grace, he began, his voice trembling slightly. There's something you need to know. She leaned forward, her heart pounding. What is it? Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't just stumble into your life by chance. I've been trying to make up for something. For someone I failed a long time ago. Grace frowned, confused. Ethan, what are you talking about? He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. Your father, Daniel Sullivan. He was my brother. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Grace stared at him, her mind racing to process what he had just said. "You're saying you're my uncle?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I didn't know at first, but when I started learning about Tyler's case, I saw the connection. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how." Grace leaned back in her chair, her emotions a whirlwind of shock, anger, and confusion. "Why now? Why tell me this now?" "Because you deserve the truth," Ethan said softly. "And because I'm running out of time. I didn't want to leave without you knowing, without trying to make things right." Grace's hands trembled as she rubbed her temples, her mind replaying every interaction she'd had with Ethan in a new light. "All this time," she murmured, "you've been helping us because of guilt." "No," Ethan said firmly. "Not just guilt. Because I see how hard you fight for Tyler. Because I see the same strength in you that I saw in Daniel. You remind me of him, Grace, in all the best ways." Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to reconcile her emotions. "I don't know what to say, Ethan. I'm angry, but I'm also grateful. You didn't have to help us, and yet you did. I should have been there for your father," Ethan admitted, his voice breaking. "But I can't change the past. All I can do now is try to be here for you and Tyler." Grace reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You already have been. You've done more for us than I could have ever expected." Ethan's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he squeezed her hand weakly. "I just want you both to have a chance. A better one than I gave your father." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling between them. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice steady. "If we're going to move forward, it has to be together. Tyler needs to know the truth, but he also needs stability. We have to make a plan. For his future, for all of us." Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I like the sound of that." As the tension in the room eased, Grace felt a strange sense of peace. The truth had shaken her, but it also brought clarity. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her burdens begin to lighten, knowing she didn't have to carry them alone. When she left Ethan's room later, she found Tyler waiting anxiously in the hallway. She knelt in front of him, her hands on his shoulders. "Tyler," she said gently, "there's something we need to talk about. But first, I need you to know that everything's going to be okay." Tyler looked at her, his brow furrowed with uncertainty. "What is it?" Grace glanced back toward Ethan's room, then met Tyler's gaze. "We have family we didn't know about, and I think it's time we start figuring out what that means. For all of us." Tyler nodded slowly, the tension in his posture easing as Grace pulled him into a hug. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope, a fragile but undeniable spark that told her they could face whatever came next. Together. The weeks that followed Ethan's revelation were a whirlwind of emotion and action. Grace had spent countless nights by Ethan's side, working together to finalize plans for Tyler's future. Ethan, though visibly weaker, was more determined than ever to leave behind something meaningful. Something that would ensure Grace and Tyler had the stability he had failed to provide for his own brother. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the window of Ethan's hospital room, Grace sat beside him, reviewing the legal documents he had insisted on signing. His attorney had been in earlier to finalize the arrangements. Tyler's custody was being transferred to Grace, and a substantial trust fund was being established for his education and future needs. "You didn't have to do all this," Grace said softly, her eyes scanning the papers. Ethan, reclining against the pillows, gave a faint smile. "Yes, I did. It's the only way I know how to make up for the past." Grace set the papers down and looked at him, her expression both grateful and sorrowful. "You've done more for us than I can ever repay." Ethan reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. "You don't owe me anything, Grace. Just take care of him. And yourself. That's all I ask." The following days saw Ethan's health decline rapidly. He spent most of his time resting, though he insisted on seeing Tyler as often as possible. The bond between them had grown unexpectedly deep, with Tyler often sitting quietly at Ethan's side, asking questions about his father and listening intently to Ethan's stories. On Ethan's last evening, the air in his room was calm, almost serene. Grace sat on one side of the bed, Tyler on the other. Ethan's breathing was labored, but his eyes were clear as he looked at them both. "Tyler," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy leaned closer, his expression serious. "Yeah, I need you to promise me something," Ethan said, his gaze unwavering. "Listen to Grace. Trust her. She's your family, and she'll always have your back." Tyler nodded, his throat tight. "I promise." Ethan turned to Grace, his eyes softening. "You've always been stronger than you realize. Don't forget that." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she smiled through them. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." That night, Ethan passed away peacefully, a faint smile still on his lips. The day after Ethan's passing, Grace and Tyler sat together in the quiet of her small apartment. Tyler was uncharacteristically subdued, his gaze distant. Grace reached for a small, sealed envelope that had been left among Ethan's belongings. On the front, in his neat handwriting, were their names, Grace and Tyler. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a letter, written in Ethan's steady, familiar script. "Dear Grace and Tyler, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I don't want you to dwell on sadness. I've had a full life, and meeting the two of you has been the most meaningful part of it. Grace, I don't have the words to express how much I admire your strength, your compassion, and your determination. You remind me so much of your father, but you're also your own person, a force to be reckoned with. You've carried so much on your shoulders, and it's time for you to let go of some of that weight. Trust yourself, and trust those who care about you. Tyler, you're at the beginning of your journey, and it won't always be easy. But you have something most people never find. Someone who loves you unconditionally. Let Grace be your guide. Lean on her when you need to, and don't be afraid to carve your own path. You have so much potential, and I know you'll do great things. I've made mistakes, more than my share. But helping the two of you has given me a chance to leave this world with a little more peace than I thought I'd have. You've given me a purpose I didn't think I deserved, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Take care of each other, your family, and that's the most important thing in the world. With all my love, Ethan." By the time Grace finished reading, tears streamed down her cheeks. Tyler sat silently beside her, his eyes glistening as he processed the words. "He really cared about us," Tyler said quietly. Grace nodded, folding the letter carefully and placing it back in the envelope. "He did, more than we realized." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the letter settling over them like a warm blanket. Despite the loss, there was comfort in knowing Ethan's actions had been driven by genuine love and redemption. "I think he'd want us to move forward," Grace said finally, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Tyler looked at her, his expression resolute. "We will. Together." As the sun set outside the window, casting the room in a golden glow, Grace felt a quiet sense of hope. Ethan's legacy wasn't just the financial security he had provided. It was the bond he had strengthened between her and Tyler, a bond they would carry with them as they navigated the future. And in that moment, Grace realized Ethan's sacrifice had been more than just an act of redemption. It had been a gift of love, one that would echo in their lives for years to come. The weeks after Ethan's passing were a time of quiet adjustment for Grace and Tyler. Though the grief lingered, it was accompanied by a sense of purpose, a determination to honor the man who had changed their lives in ways they hadn't expected. Grace returned to work at the hospital with renewed energy, her interactions with patients taking on a deeper meaning. She found herself drawing strength from Ethan's journey, remembering how even in his final days, he had chosen to give rather than retreat. One evening, as she walked through the hospital's pediatric ward, she stopped to comfort a frightened child awaiting surgery. Sitting at the bedside, she shared the same calm reassurance Ethan had given her when she'd felt overwhelmed. Afterward, Grace stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker. For years, she had carried the weight of her struggles alone, keeping people at arm's length. But Ethan had shown her the value of connection, of allowing others to help. He'd reminded her that vulnerability didn't have to be a weakness. At home, Tyler was changing too. Grace often found him quieter, more introspective. One afternoon, she came home to find him at the kitchen table, filling out a volunteer application for a local shelter. "What's this?" she asked, setting down her bag. Tyler glanced up, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "I thought I could help out. With kids or something." Grace's chest tightened with pride. "That's a great idea," she said softly. "What made you think of it?" He shrugged, though the emotion in his voice was clear. "Ethan, he didn't have to help us, but he did. I want to do something like that." Grace reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "He'd be proud of you." The shelter quickly became a place where Tyler found purpose. Helping others gave him a sense of belonging, and Grace saw a new confidence emerge in him. One evening, as they sat together at the dining table, Tyler looked up from his homework. "You think Ethan knew how much he changed things for us?" Grace smiled, her eyes warm. "I think he did, and I think he'd want us to keep passing that on." In honoring Ethan's memory, they found healing, carrying forward the legacy of love and redemption he had left behind. The grand opening of the community center was a quiet, heartfelt event. The building, nestled in the heart of the city, stood as a testament to Ethan's legacy. Its sleek yet welcoming design featured bright spaces for children to play, classrooms for tutoring, and resources for families in need. Above the entrance, a simple plaque read, "The Wallace Center, a place for second chances." Grace stood by the door, greeting the first visitors with a warm smile. Tyler was by her side, handing out brochures and showing an ease she hadn't seen in him before. The center's creation had been a labor of love, its funding a part of Ethan's carefully laid plans to ensure his impact stretched far beyond his time. As families began to fill the rooms, Grace took a moment to step back, letting the scene sink in. Children laughed as they explored the playroom, while parents spoke with volunteers about programs and support. It was everything she had dreamed of, but more than that, it was a tangible representation of Ethan's transformation. A man who had learned, in the end, how much love and connection could change a life. Tyler walked up beside her, his hands in his pockets as he watched the bustling activity. "You think he'd like it?" he asked, his voice quiet. Grace looked at him, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "I think he'd love it," she said. "This is exactly what he wanted, to make a difference." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace and Tyler drove to the cemetery. They walked in silence to Ethan's grave, the crisp air carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. Standing before the polished stone, Grace set down a small bouquet of white lilies. She rested a hand gently on the marker, her voice steady as she spoke. "We did it, Ethan. The center's open, and it's helping people, just like you wanted." Tyler stepped forward, his head bowed. "Thanks for everything," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll make you proud." As they stood together, the breeze picked up, brushing softly against their faces. Grace closed her eyes, a sense of calm washing over her. In the quiet breeze, they felt Ethan's love guiding them forward.